And today I have a guest from all the way across the pond, Jonathan Pearce. Thank you for joining me today.
Hello.
It's great to have you. And I just wanted to give a brief bio for Jonathan, in case anyone doesn't know him. He is a teacher and philosopher from South Hampshire, UK. And you're a student of all manner of things philosophical and theological. An agnostic atheist who finds the subject of the existence of God an all-consuming and obsessive one. And in terms of your education, you had a master's in philosophy from the University of Wales, a degree from the University of Leeds, and a postgrad certificate of education from the University of St. Mary's in Twickenham. Hopefully I got that right. And you're a founding member of a group called the Tippling Philosophers. For anyone who doesn't know what the word tippling means, that refers to having a drink. So it's a friendly group of disparate believers and non-believers and sort of believers based in Hampshire. And you're a big advocate of casual philosophy groups meeting over pints of good ale. I did want to ask, was that the group Tippling Philosophers, was that in any way a reference or did you think about the C.S. Lewis's group, the Inklings? I noticed you're, okay.
What a fantastic connection you've made there, because no one's ever said that before, but actually it wasn't me. So the guy that properly founded it, I was like a founder member, but he at the time was quite a conservative Christian. He's not particularly now. So there's an interesting story in that. But he was really big into C.S. Lewis and loved the idea of the Inklings, the group that him and Tolkien that used, and some others that used to hang out. Was Lewis Carroll a member as well? I don't know. That used to hang out and just, chew the cud, the philosophical and theological cud. And so we did that, and that's where my blog took its name from. I'm just a tippling philosopher. I'm not the tippling philosophers, So I just, a bit of brand placement, their product placement.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. Yeah, and I saw too. You do a little bit of work, or did a little bit of work with a group called Skeptic Inc. Is that correct?
So yeah, when I was sort of blogging, and I was over with John Loftus at Debunking Christianity, doing some posts for him and writing and whatnot. And yeah, I was asked to be a founder member of that blog network, which is still going. And then I was asked to come and write for Patheist, non-religious channel at the Patheist network. So that was a great honor. And there I've stayed. But yeah, as I said to you before we started this, when you've written over 3,000 blog posts and you're counting that up and thinking that's probably 1 million words. You think, wow, I've done a lot of blogging. I've got a lot to say about probably not a lot.
Well, I've looked through a lot of your articles. I'm intrigued to read more. Of the ones I've read so far have been very, very, they pull you in. You've got a lot of great topics there, even just the titles. And I want to go over some of the titles of your books here in a second as well. You have, with your family there, you have twin boys. How old are they?
They are now 10.
Okay, wow.
10 years old.
That's
two
awesome.
Boys, and funnily enough, talking about books, one of my earlier books is The Survival Guide for Dads. I've just released a second edition of that. Just because when you do books, it's really interesting. You probably know this. When you look on Amazon, if a book's like 2011, right, and it's now 2020, you're like, yeah, not really bothered. But if it's 2020, that's a really big. So with some of my earlier books, especially with that, which is like a non-fiction book that's a help guide for dads of twins, actually to have 2020 new edition, that makes a really big difference to how people do their shopping, right? Yeah. So I've just released the second edition to that, and because it's not easy being a dad of twin boys. I don't want to gender stereotype, but yeah, tough gig.
What do you remember as some of the hardest parts of that, especially when they were little?
Well, everything's hard. Actually, as they get older, things get harder because they sleep less, they talk more, they argue more, they have more activities that you have to take them to, and so on and so forth. Which is all wonderful, but when they can also be fairly demanding. Yeah. I mean, the whole issue to do with how do you teach your children religion or beliefs, or any belief, actually, politics, religion, any kind of thing that revolves around rationality, especially as a teacher myself, you don't want to teach them the conclusion. Okay, so with as far as God goes, so my boys now know that I don't believe in God, but I remember Oscar, one of my twins, saying to me a couple of years ago, what do you believe about this, Daddy? Blah, 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 blah. Oh, I want to believe that too. And I was like, no, what we can't have is you. And it was really interesting to hear him say, what we can't have is you as a small person saying, I want to believe this just because you believe it. I don't want you to have that conclusion. I want you to have whatever conclusion you come to, but it better be based on some really good rational argumentation and evidence.
Right.
And that's what I want to teach you. I want to teach you the processes of coming to a conclusion. I don't want to teach you the conclusion.
That's awesome. Yeah,
I know you're a dad yourself, right?
Yeah, we don't have twins, but it's still a busy house. We have 4 kids under age 6. So it's very, very busy. They're awesome kids, though, truly awesome in every way. It's a joy. But I've thought of what life would be like if we ever had twins or triplets, and that would really put a whole new spin on it.
Yeah.
But I've read some of Dale McGowan's stuff too, and he's got a very similar thought on.
Do you know what? I've not read his book on secular parenting, which he's written, but I'm in close contact. He kind of runs Patheos Non-Religious, and he's a general legend. So Dale's a good man.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get together with him at some point. I literally live about 20 minutes from him here in Atlanta. So yeah, we're very close. To give the final part of the bio, you do have a YouTube channel, which I'll be putting a link in at the bottom of this video. And before I go over your book titles real quick, I noticed that you lived near the English Channel across from the Isle of Wight. Is that right?
I do. Yeah, presently I can see it almost from my house. Not quite. I need to walk to the beach, but yeah.
That's awesome. That's an amazing thing. I've been to somewhere where I could see the Isle of Wight once many years ago, and it was just beautiful. So I can't imagine seeing that every day. That's awesome.
Yeah, so it's a nice island, and they have the Cowls boat race around there every year. So apart from this year, because half the world's ill. Yeah, that's a good idea.
In terms of your books, just to go through a few of them real quick, and we'll go. Hopefully have a little bit of time to look into this more toward the end, but just to give a few titles for anyone who hasn't heard your books. One of them is called Free Will, an investigation into whether we have free will, or whether I was always going to write this book, which is just a fantastic title. I love that. That's awesome. The Little Book of Unholy Questions. I read through some of the questions that I believe came from that book. That was fantastic.
Do you know what? I love this book because some of there's like 501 questions that I asked God, and she still hasn't answered. But nonetheless, some of them are irreverent questions. But it's those irreverent questions that actually, when you just take a bit of time to savor them, think about them, they're incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
So, for example, does God have a sense of humor? Where you think, oh, what a silly question. No, this is important. Does God have a sense of humor? Because when we talk about God having personhood and personality, when we talk about our own personalities and relationships we have with other people with personhood, we talk about sense of humor being one of the most important things in another person. We talk about that as like, I fall in love with someone because they are funny and they make me laugh and I can make them laugh, and that kind of that interpersonal relationship is really important. So then when you're expecting me to fall in love with God, literally to have a loving relationship with God, but if God knows everything in advance and there's nothing that's a surprise and there's nothing, then, and can God be funny? And if God can't be funny, either find things funny or be funny himself or itself, then what kind of relationship am I expecting to have with this entity? Do you know what I mean? So it's a question that seems seemingly irreverent to begin with actually can unlock a load of really interesting ideas, and that's why I loved writing this book and just like surfing the world and people's minds for interesting questions to ask God. Yeah, so the idea is that although some of those questions are loaded, and I ask them because they have a particular answer that's obviously the case, and that leads you towards a kind of atheistic conclusion. There are some questions that are simply irreverent and then demand you to think further and have other conversations and questions. And I just absolutely loved writing it and surfing people's minds around the world for different questions to add in there. So yeah, great book. I did enjoy that.
when I look back on my deconversion, which happened about 13 months ago, I was a very, very strong evangelical Christian for 43 years. I mean, take away the first couple of years of my childhood, but when you grow up in it, you pretty much place your faith in Christ when you're 4 or 5 years old, usually. So if you add those, couple of years when I was a child, 43 years, the deconversion, it started in large part with some of those kinds of questions. It was, the first part was more about the horrible parts, the genocide, the slavery, all that stuff. But then it quickly got into the ridiculous stuff, like not only does this look bad, it doesn't, it sounds so bad it doesn't sound right. But then you get into just the ridiculous stuff, which I think sounds like a lot of your book goes over. Like, you just think through this. Does this really make sense? This kind of gets a little bit crazy if you take it to its logical conclusion. And then the big part that really pulled me out was just, I kind of dropped all the philosophical questions at the end and said, I just want to purely study, where did this thing come from? Because I'd been to, Bible college, mission school, endless years of training, but no one had ever really taught me the origins of it all. And that was kind of what sealed the deal. But the crazy questions really make a big part of it too.
So that's really interesting. I think there's an element of anthropology that's interesting. So where does God, and any particular God, so you're talking about history, archaeology, and anthropology of, say, the Middle East area. And then you've got psychology. So why do we believe in God? And I think, quite often these days, like, all the books I've written are meaningless because I'm not going to convince a Christian outside of their Christianity, because actually they arrived at their conclusion psychologically, right, from within a familial household and society, and God serves as a function. So if I need to convince you out of that, I need to use psychology to do it.
Right.
And so in a sense, this is quite a nice hobby, or it's an interest, but it won't serve the purpose I would like it to do. And so you have, I think the psychology of religion is where it's at, to be honest. And yes, I find that interesting with someone like yourself, particularly as a new convert, where were in evangelical Christianity, which sometimes, and I don't, you can answer this in a second, but sometimes can be quite an authoritarian, moralistic framework, where God has a very strong psychological function. When you come out of that, you are empty to some degree. You need to fill that. You need to replace that functionality with something else. Yeah. And this is why I think sometimes you also get another psychological thing that happens, which is that when people come out of a really strong religious background, they do a 180 flip and become a militant atheist, partly because they're so peed off that they've spent all that time, wasted that time, that actually it builds up a lot of sort of anger, and you become an entrenched militant atheist, if you like. And so I think there's a lot of psychology involved in religion. There's a lot in belief and in deconversion. And I think, as far as you're concerned, you're probably in a far better position to be able to elucidate that than me.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I by the way, I do want to get to your background in just a second too, but just to answer that, and then I'll get back to your books. That is definitely the way it works, and the psychology of it. It's ironic. I was working on several books right before my deconversion, but one of them was a book about Christian worldview, and about the idea that nothing is random. In other words, God, the God I believed in, he doesn't just. It's not chance and luck. It's obviously not evolution. It's very specifically, like, everything is meant to say something about his nature, his personality. So I was trying to just understand all of nature, from universes down to molecular biology stuff, to say, how does this tell us something about Yahweh? And one of the big questions that I had in my intro to that book was the question of, how do you change someone's worldview? And I had endless notes about it, which I'm probably going to have to go back to at some point just to kind of get a chuckle and to see if I can address some of that here on this side. But it fascinated me because it was stuff like, obviously, childhood indoctrination, something very, very troubling, like if someone dies suddenly, it kind of shakes you up. Obviously, repetition, if someone just drills into you, this is true, this is true, this is true, it helps you. But how do you actually change it voluntarily? And it was funny, with all that thinking, the thought of deconversion from Christianity never crossed my mind. And yet that was obviously the biggest worldview change that was yet to come.
And what's interesting, I think, it depends what kind of change you want. So if you want a really healthy change, then you could argue that it needs to be more gradual.
Yes.
And so something like a Jonathan Haidt approach of like, imagine you're riding on an elephant and you're going in the same direction. You just need to be nudged a little bit. And in order for that to happen, you need this person to be going in broadly the same direction, which means that this person's a member of your in-group. So what I mean by this is that if you're an evangelical Christian, you need to be nudged out of that by a liberal Christian, right? An atheist ain't going to cut the mustard, right? You're going to backfire effect. You're going to entrench in your individual position, and you will be more staunchly going in that direction, right? So because the atheist is coming like that, right? So what you need is that nudging. So the liberal Christian would do this, and another liberal Christian with a slightly different viewpoint, and then you've got like some other type of worldview, maybe a liberal Muslim or whatever. Yeah, you end up moving ever so slightly, and then eventually like a liberal. Eventually you get like an atheist that's quite similar to your position in other ways, and an in-group in other ways. Do you know what I mean? And then you end up with a completely different direction. Yeah. But it's been a gradual and more healthy affair. And I think that when I give public talks on arguments against God, for example, so one of my talks is God on trial, and I take 5 arguments and I go to town on God. If I've got Christians in the audience, then I'll say, look, I'm not going to convince you, right? You're here, and everything I say will entrench you further in your position. So, I hope you enjoy it. But I don't expect to convert you. And what I suppose the best that you can hope for when you are antithetically opposed to someone else's position is to sow a seed. So here's an example. One of the guys. From the Tippling Philosophers who was a Christian, I remember arguing about evolution, and he denied evolution, and for like 7 years or however long we were just arguing the toss over evolution. And I produced this point, and didn't do anything. But I must have sowed a seed, because he then emailed Simon Conway Morris, who is an Christian evolutionary biologist at Cambridge. I think it's Cambridge. And he presented all the same arguments as I did, right? But because he was the in-group, those arguments had purchase and pushed my friend over to eventually accepting evolution, and now he accepts evolution. But it wasn't the contents of the arguments from, or at least the deliverer. It was the deliverer. It was, the important point was the person who delivered it was part of his in-group, and so he attached more value to those arguments.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When I look back at mine, I would say that definitely was the case. I had a retired gentleman that was a friend of mine back from a different job, excuse me, and he at one point, he's definitely a liberal Christian, and at this point, I'm not sure why he even calls himself a Christian. It's so liberal. But I remember asking him at one point, as an evangelical does, where are you with God? Where are you with the gospel? And his answer was just very basic. He said, well, let me ask you this, Tim. Does it make sense that if God wanted to love the whole world and he wanted to give them a message, that he would speak to one little teeny tribe instead of speaking to people everywhere? And of course, I had my answers to, well, God, that's what God does. He elects, people, and he chooses people. But that was just a seed, and it sat in the back of my mind for years, and eventually it kind of grew. And I don't know why that I never really had the genocide seed planted, but at some point I kind of planted that in my own head, or probably YouTube video at some point planted it. But that seed again, it grows. And
yeah, so what's interesting there, if I was a Christian, there's absolutely no doubt that I would be some form of universalist who denies heaven and hell, right? And seeing the evolution of a close friend who was a conservative Christian, who's now then dabbled with sort of agnosticism, is now re-embraced Christianity, but universalist Christianity. And I'm so happy with that, which is like your form of Christianity is so much more healthy now, because it's to say that God, if God creates the world, he isn't going to favor a certain amount of people, because that is just unfair, right?
Yeah.
So everyone that's created will somehow join God in heaven, or not in heaven, because that's judgmental. You have in heaven in union. Everyone will get there, irrespective of what the cards you were dealt out with at birth. And so therefore you take away this kind of unfairness aspect, and you take away, you know, the influence of genetics and culture and environment and heritage to give everyone a fighting chance, or everyone the same chance of having union with God. And that's a God who is far more, you know, attractive as a proposition than the kind of Yahweh or God of the Bible.
Yeah. The one thing I would say, and I'd love to have your thoughts on this before we go to the next points. The idea of Christians, like, they can't be convinced because it wasn't facts and rationality that got them in. So that's not what's going to get them out. It's psychology. But could I ask this? One of the projects that I'm working on, and this is kind of the project that's on my heart more, like, I love doing interviews because I'm meeting amazing people, and I feel like people need to have their stories told again and again, and people that aren't telling them need to have a platform and tell them. But kind of the personal project that I'm working on, that I'm going to be doing maybe one video a month for, is just this study of where Christianity and Judaism actually came from. And the one thing that I think is it's a seed in a sense, but it's a seed that really shakes people up, is the idea of actually, in a way that's very hard to deny, show people where this actually came from. So, for example, the Dennis MacDonald stuff with mimesis, showing, you know, that this stuff came from the Homeric epics. If you can do that really well, I think it crosses over. If like people, I think when I look at some of the philosophical arguments, there's always like you made a good point, but I can make a good one, and I can find some apologists who can argue better than I can, so we'll counter you. But if someone can just prove, look, this thing didn't come from where you thought it was, like, if you can debunk the starting point of the whole religion, which really, I mean, the biggest one is to go back to Yahweh and to say, where did Yahweh come from? Where did Elohim and Elohim come from? When you pull that apart and you can show someone that's really it feels like that seed kind of...
Yeah. So what happens there, I think, is that someone who's into that stuff, really, that floats their boat. You know, that interests me. I love that. And if I read that, I'm like, yeah, this is so powerful, man. This should convince X, Y, and Z. But of course, it's a very elitist approach to, and funnily enough, it's also why I don't think God exists. Is another argument that in order to properly understand God, you have to be such an intellectual to be able to understand the theology properly of the Bible, to get all the connections that were supposedly in there, and this and the you know, reference to that, and to understand how atonement works, and to understand how the Trinity works. All this, you have to be so literally, you have to be intelligent enough to be able to get that it's elitist, and so therefore I don't think any religion that has an elitist basis is a fair religion, and therefore doesn't come from an all-loving God. So but you can flip that onto, I suppose, the atheist sort of side of things, to say that actually, if I'm going to convince people, this is a very elitist, like Dennis MacDonald, the work of his work is brilliant, but you've already got to be up here and have a certain amount of knowledge to even remotely access that. Okay, so that's like intellectual, you know, self-loving up here that you can do to because you love doing that kind of stuff, and it kind of already convinces an already convinced mind even more. But I don't know that it will necessarily, you know, if you're going to go and witness on the street as an atheist and or go into an evangelical church, this is why I think, and we'll probably come to this, is why I think things like the problem of evil is where you go, because actually the problem of evil is what is emotive and goes to the heart. And you know, we know this from politics. You win an election on emotive issues, right? And if you can get people engaged enough emotionally to go out and vote, then you've done that. So if you get people engaged enough emotionally about belief in God, and to show that either God is love and God is awesome and gets you like emotionally for it, or God is horrible and look at all the cancer and tsunamis, then I think That's not to say your project isn't of great worth, because it would be. I would love that. Man, that floats my boat. But as far as your initial opening gambit to deconvert people, I wonder. I don't know. I don't want to be negative, right?
Yeah, there might be certain personalities that tend to be more open, even just to listening, not even to thinking through, but just some people would just say, you know what, I just don't even care to listen. Thanks, but no thanks. And whether it's other people would say, I don't think I'm going to agree, but sure, I'll listen. What do you have to say? So, but I agree that the emotional part of it is definitely critical. Well, I don't want to take too much time to talk about my projects. I do want to get talking about yours. Let me just read through a couple more of your book titles, and then I wanted to get to your story, if it's okay. The next book title, The Nativity, A Critical Examination. That sounds awesome. Is that more on the emotional philosophical side, or is that more about just historical ideas? Or
it's predominantly historical. I loved writing that book, and in fact, I'm writing a sister book right now on the resurrection, called "The Resurrection: A Critical Examination of the Easter Story." And I think it's the book I've most enjoyed writing ever. It's just writing itself. Man, the resurrection, there's so much there, but it's similar to the nativity, and the nativity is an interesting one. So if we rewind a little bit, because this is actually dead important.
Please.
When I first started with the Tippling Philosophers, one of the first big arguments that was a light bulb moment for me was the free will argument, right? And the free will argument is so damned important that everything else is irrelevant. All of those books I've written after the free will book are irrelevant, because if the Christian, not the Calvinist, if any sort of more orthodox Christian or Muslim or Jew cannot establish libertarian free will, so the idea that you can do something else in a given situation. And let's just explain that a little bit. So Tim, if you right now at t = 0, let's call this causal circumstance t = 0, where you have a universe, let's pause the universe. Everything is in a particular state. Your prior learning is in a particular state. Your genetics, your biology, your environment, everything, right? You choose to book a holiday to the Bahamas, right? And we carry on living for 10 minutes, 10 hours, 10 days, and rewind to that moment, t = 0, right? Everything is the same down to every wave function, every quantum state is the same, right? What would allow you or cause you to choose other than going on holiday to the Bahamas if every single thing about the universe was identical? And the only answer you can give to that makes any sense is random. And of course, random isn't free will. So for example, you could randomly, like you have your choice machine as a brain and you go Bahamas or somewhere else, Bahamas, somewhere else, Bahamas. Next time you did it, somewhere else. But if that free will doesn't really like random, because if you have a freely will decision, randoms, you don't really have ownership over that, right? So you can't be blamed and punished and praised for that if it's random. So throw that away. Rewind. What if the whole universe was identical? What could cause you? Because it has to be caused, because if it's not caused, it's uncaused, and if it's uncaused, it's random. So actually, there does need to be causation. So this is the whole fundamental problem with free will, is that it tries to get away from causation, but if you don't have causation, nothing makes sense and it looks random, right? So that's a really whistle-stop tour through some basics of the free will debate. Now, here's the thing. If you have a God that judges people, and people are going to make the decision they make because they are the person they are in the situation they are in, then the judgment is inherently unfair, which is why heaven and hell is inherently unfair. You've got digital, two places for a whole spectrum of behavior, and all that behavior is people doing what they're going to do in the situation they're in because they are who they are, right? So what I would say, so I often, as we do when we're in a shower, we think of how would I debate William Lane Craig, right? So any apologist, the first argument you need to have is a free will argument, because if you cannot establish libertarian free will, your religion falls apart. End of. There is the kind of moralism and the judgment that's involved in your monotheism almost invariably requires libertarian free will. So as we say in philosophy, all these other arguments supervene on, they depend upon the free will argument. So that is fundamental. Nothing else matters, and no one has established how free will works, right? And it's still they haven't. And so for me, it's just like, well, that's the end of it. So after that free will book, I could have just given up and said, well, unless anyone comes back to me with a coherent argument for free will, nothing else matters. The nativity, a load of rubbish. Like, if you don't have free will, right, judgment doesn't make sense in the way that God metes out judgment. So therefore the atonement doesn't make sense. For Jesus dying to atone for our sins doesn't make sense, and blah, blah, blah. So it's all irrelevant. Now, that didn't stop me writing a load of books. So even though I know that, I love writing about history. This is like a puzzle, right? The nativity. Why are only 2 gospels have accounts of Jesus' birth, for a start? That's crazy. Why does Luke have Jesus's family, Joseph and Mary? Luke has them living up in Nazareth and traveling down for a census to Bethlehem, but Matthew has them living in Bethlehem already and has Herod involved. Now, Luke doesn't mention Herod at all and the slaughter of the innocents, and Matthew doesn't mention the census. Herod lived 10 years after the census, or 10 years before the census, sorry. So there's a 10-year gap. So those 2 accounts are impossible to harmonize, right? And that is a historical puzzle, and it's really exciting, and I loved writing that. And it just, you can unpick the nativity, which means the messianic basis of Jesus is fulfilling the prophecies of coming out of Egypt, which only happens in Matthew. You know, it's all these kind of ideas. You can pick it apart, and it falls to pieces. So the nativity accounts fail, and they're the only accounts, apart from aspects of the resurrection, that intersect with known history. So here's the question: if this intersects with known history and fails, when the rest of Jesus' life after that, before the resurrection, like the wedding at Cana, the resurrection of Lazarus, these have no intersection with history. We can't verify that. They are just assertions of the gospel writers, right? If where it does intersect with history, it fails, how can we say that when it doesn't intersect with history, it passes the test?
Yeah.
And therefore the whole of Jesus's life is problematic. So, and then I'm doing the same at the moment with the resurrection, which is to say, I can look at burial accounts, I can look at all these Pontius Pilate, I can look at all these ideas of history that the resurrection intersects with, and still it fails. Yeah. Right? So you're bookending Jesus's life with historical problems, all the stuff that goes on in the middle, which is all Jesus's cool miracles and life and teachings. What's that based on? Because the historical parts of his life fail. Yeah. So you're hanging this theology on nothing. So that although the free will thing kind of precludes doing any other theological work, because if you can't get past the free will, what's the point of the rest of it? I still enjoy doing the rest of it loads.
Yeah. With the nativity book, just a couple quick questions. Do you go into either the pagan parallels with some of the stories? In other words, like this was already a story that people told in different ways for hundreds of, maybe even thousands of years, and this looks, eerily similar with just a few minor tweaks? And also, do you look at the other extra canonical books as you're doing this, or are you strictly focused on the 4 Gospels?
So good question. So contemporary mythology is interesting because there are loads of parallels, but the more you look, the more you can find. And I think it's dangerous. So someone like Robert Price is just a master at this, but I think he can fall into the trap of finding things that aren't really there, or that are just correlations rather than causations. And I think there are common motifs, because humans are the same to a degree throughout history, and in different societies we have the same kind of ideas, and so you will find the same motifs happening, but it's dangerous to put too much into that. So I think it does have a place, but just be warned about how far you take that. And you don't need to rely on that, because there's so many other problems, like the census, like the taxation idea of the census, right? We have censuses, and we know the Romans had censuses for taxation reasons, right? So why would you, as Joseph, be sent to the place of the birth of an ancestor 41 generations in the past? Yeah, why not 5 generations
Like 1,000 years earlier.
41 generations, David. So then it's like, so if I moved to the country and he moved out of tax area, you have tax censuses in order to work out who lives where, so that you can get the right amount of taxation from that area, and you can plan as the Romans did. You don't want to send the entire population to a random place that they won't even know, most of them. And why 41 generations is everyone went to 41 generations past, the whole country would be moving, right? And it would be an absolute nightmare. But then if it's just go to somewhere, if it's not stipulated 41 generations, then everyone can find, it's like we're all connected to King Charlemagne, right? So everyone will be able to connect themselves in their family tree somewhere to King David. So everyone would be going to Bethlehem, because everyone would be like, yeah, I'm connected to David. And so the whole of Israel would have been like hot stepping it to Bethlehem, to the house of David, because, you know, everyone wants to be connected to it. It's just nonsense. The whole thing's nonsense.
And wouldn't the census,
and it's nonsense for so many reasons.
And wouldn't it have been for the purpose of taxation ultimately, so they can get more money, which means that they want to see what property you have. So they want to see your, oh, I've got one house, no, I've got two houses, you know, I've got this, I've got that. They want to see what you own to see how much they can tax you for. So if you're out on vacation, you know, you're traveling, you know, 100 miles away, they're not going to see what your, you know, your stuff. And
no,
it'd be so easy.
One of the Christian defense is that, well, actually we've got evidence in Egypt of a Roman taxation where they got itinerant workers to go back to where they lived. So there's evidence of people moving it's like, no, those are itinerant workers that, like, in modern day terms, would be contractors, right? They're contracting over there for like 2 years to build a pyramid or whatever. So we need them to come home where they've got a house and a family, and where they ordinarily live. They just happen to be working over there. We're pulling them back there to do the tax census, so that we know that in that area where they are usually resident, that is what we would get from taxation for this period, and we can do our budgeting from there. What they didn't have is people moving all over the shop in the way that is claimed by Luke in the Lucan census. So yeah, it's just nonsense.
Do you, as you do your research and your writing, do you deal at all with couple things? I guess you can't put them under more of an esoteric umbrella, but do you deal with either astrotheology or numerology, or some of the stuff that's you might call angelology, trying to explain where some of the different mystical Jewish groups were coming from at that point, as they began to flesh out these mythologies, you know, to say, well, what did they believe? What was the driving force behind them? Do you deal with any of those?
No, the simple answer would be no, I don't really. A book that I have consulted on and edited by Aaron Adair, called The Star of Bethlehem, looks somewhat into astrology and the place, the role that had in contemporary societies, to try and explain the Star of Bethlehem in a skeptical light, or in a critical manner. And that would probably be the closest, but generally, no. I've kept mainly to the kind of contradictions and historical problems that avail themselves.
Yeah, there's probably more than enough meat to work on there anyway.
You did ask me another question with the nativity originally, contemporary mythology and something else, but I've forgotten what that something else was.
The extra canonical books, the other gospels.
Oh yeah, so what? Yeah, not particularly, other than occasional reference. In the resurrection book I'm writing now, there is some interesting things concerning that, regarding the non-canonical texts. So when you look at someone like Joseph of Arimathea, through Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, you see a gradual embellishment to Joseph of Arimathea, and then if you take that on through the extra canonical books, he is even more embellished until he's going to Glastonbury in England and all these kind of funky stuff, right? So there's this general line of embellishment, and then I was doing some work the other day on the secret Gospel of Mark, which is actually Mark, but there's a longer version of Mark that we've got evidence of through a letter that has now been lost, from Clement of Alexandria. And in that, so in the Gospel of Mark, you have this young man in a white robe that pops up a few times throughout the Gospel of Mark. And he does it in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he is disrobed and runs off naked. And then there's a young man, the same word used, a young man in the tomb, in a white robe, in a white linen, in the empty tomb of Mark, or not in the tomb of Mark. And people think that's an angel. But actually, if you take it, if you know stuff about the secret Gospel of Mark, you know that actually this figure pops up as a resurrected guy. So Jesus, I think, resurrects him as a young man earlier, and he actually follows right throughout Jesus's whole trajectory through the Gospel of Mark, through this longer gospel. This person pops up and is kind of representative of you, the reader, as a true disciple going through that journey with Jesus. And it makes loads of sense then.
That's fascinating.
When you just look at the truncated gospel, the canonical gospel, like that young man suddenly being stripped naked and running off is random. And then this young man in the tomb is random. But when you piece it together, it makes sense. So actually you can derive some really useful stuff from both the extra canonical, but also other versions of the canonical gospels.
I love learning tidbits like that. Just it feels like these other books that, at least as a Christian, are just kind of irrelevant. It's like, obviously they didn't put them in the canon for a reason. They're whatever, they're wrong, they're garbage, they're heretical, so ignore them. Or if you want to read them, and just for it's as good as reading Shakespeare. It's not really about the real God, and read it for fun, but not for theology. And yet when you dive into it, it's like, actually this is, it's almost like a lot of the canonical gospels were like taking this bigger story and like funneling it down. And if you don't have the full background, you don't see it. Like one of the podcasts I listen to a lot is called Dragons in Genesis, and he just goes through, and he's been going through the books, like the book of Enoch, and he talks about, like, if you don't know how the book of Enoch, what it's arguing for and what they're doing with their worldview, especially with the astrology and astrotheology, he's like, Paul doesn't make as much sense. And he was pointing out in a recent podcast, like, when you read Paul, you say the Old Testament came first and then you read Paul, it just sounds so different. But if you read the book of Enoch in between them, Paul actually makes a lot more sense. And it's that kind of background that just, I feel like it's enlightening, and it's fun as a historical, as a wannabe historian. But it also it starts to paint the picture of where this religion actually came from. And I feel like it's like you don't want to be losing more of your life to this mythology as reality. But at the same point, it's like a Stockholm syndrome. Like, if somebody tricked me that bad that I was forced into loving them, I kind of want to understand, what in the world was I doing? What was this?
But I think there is something interesting, because it would be interesting to find out the evolution of ideas in religion in another given religion on the other side of the world that had nothing to do with it. It still holds interest, right? And if it did have something major to it, played a major role in your life, then I suppose it's even more interesting, right? And there's a couple of things to say. So I think it's really interesting in the nativity accounts. Again, it's talking about, if you understand the Bible as a whole, then you understand parts of the Bible even better. So when you look at things like the Gospel of Matthew and see how he is and who his audience is, right? So he is trying to appeal to a certain audience where he is invoking Jewish Old Testament stories and retelling them through his New Testament account of, say, the Nativity. So when you look at Herod, why is he mentioned Herod? Well, Herod is the new Pharaoh. Okay, so who is Jesus? Jesus is the new Moses. So this is why in Matthew alone, he goes to Egypt for a couple of years and then comes out of Egypt. In Matthew says, so I forget the exact wording, but it's like, in order to fulfill the prophecy,
right,
out of Egypt comes the son of Israel, or whatever. So you had Jesus going to Israel for 2 years. Well, Luke didn't have that at all. Luke had him going via the temple to get circumcised back to Nazareth. Matthew has him going to there. So Herod chases him away because he's a pharaoh. Jesus is the new Moses, comes out, and so this really appeals to your Jewish audience, where, okay, Jesus is the new Moses, right, I get this, that's rubber stamp, that's validated Jesus, he's cool, I get that. So once you understand all these things, then it becomes a much richer text. But I think it also belies this complete kind of mythology that they're writing stories onto a template, or they're writing these stories in a way that they conform to Old Testament prophecies. And it's the same with the resurrection, this whole idea that Jesus fulfilled Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, Psalm 69. Load of rubbish. Read those Psalms, read that. That's broadly nothing to do with Jesus. You picked a couple of verses that could be, do you know what? I could read Sherlock Holmes and pick out a bunch of sentences that predicted me, right? But that ain't a prediction, okay? Right. So but when you have this working knowledge of the Bible as a whole, then things do become richer and much more, and you can that works for the Christian as well. Like you can, when you get involved in that, the whole thing becomes just a much richer text that interlocks and intersects with itself and refers to itself, and it becomes this all-encompassing, I don't know, revelatory text that kind of sucks you in. But,
and they really they take that in a different sense. Of they I know they call it typology, but the idea that it's almost like it's like God is progressively revealing himself, but he's kind of doing it symbolically. And so instead of them seeing it as Jesus is a rewrite, which is pretty obvious, he's a rewrite, they would say it as God was foretelling. So Moses, goes through the water, and then they go into the desert. Jesus goes through the water of baptism, and then he goes into the desert. And it's like, they just see it as if God's slowly revealing the same picture over and over and over. Yeah. And obviously it's going to culminate in the, in future glory. But
so of course the Christian says it's foreshadowing and it's prophecy, predicting the future. Whereas the skeptic says, no, it's the future scrabbling back into the past to validate itself to a new audience and whatever. What's interesting with things like prophecy, and I'm doing this in my resurrection book, which is I'm trying to add some philosophy to the kind of historical analyses. So the resurrection one is interesting because there's a lot of prophecy, but people don't realize the problem with prophecy. So if you're saying, right, 600 years previously in Daniel or whatever, we've got a prophecy of Jesus something happening with Jesus here, and this kind of proves Jesus or helps prove the narrative or whatever. You're like, okay, if God is setting something in place here that is coming to fruition here and knows that that's going to indubitably happen, then it's actually a much bigger thing you think. You have to micromanage everything in between. Like, for that prophecy to happen, Mary can't have fallen off a wall at the age of 12, right? Mary can't have got typhoid and died, right? Joseph can't have cut his hand off doing carpentry, and this and that can't have happened. There can't have been a war that happened here that wiped out the Jews, or as was, and blah blah blah. So what you have to have for a prophecy to take place is a completely micromanaged existence of the world from there to there, such that no one has any free will, because literally you have to put every brick in place so that this prophecy is eventually fulfilled over here. And I don't think people realize that. They just think, they look at two completely isolated events and say, oh, look at this, that represents this, or that was predicted by this. It's like, whoa, no, because in order for that to predict that, you have to micromanage, you have to set that all in place, and that is a really big problem.
Now, on that note, do you deal with objections or just conversations from Calvinists? Because that's my background. I not my full background, but I towards the end of my college time, I kind of gladly at that time fell into it, just kind of admitting this does look like this is more accurately depicting who God is, what his nature is, that he is a God who elects. I mean, just if you were looking at the Bible as the word of God, Romans 9 is very clear. It says, I elect, I want to, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. He even anticipates arguments of people saying that's not fair. And he says, will the thing formed, and the word in Greek is plasma, will the plasma say to the maker, why have you created me this way? And so he's like saying, how can plasma argue with God? God's the creator. And he's like, it was really clear to me through reading Romans 9 and other sections of scripture that God, as he's pictured, does do the choosing. And so therefore, and it makes logical sense to say God therefore gets all the glory. God's the one that did it. And you literally could be burning in hell and you still wouldn't pick God unless God first said, I pick you. I give you the grace to look up at me and repent.
So the whole Calvinism thing with free will, I was on the BBC once in a televised debate on free will, something called Big Questions, which is like on a Sunday morning. It's religion and philosophy, and you have like a panel of people in an audience, and we had one on free will. And there was Calvinists there. I was sat next to the Calvinist. I was like, mate, actually, to be honest, we agree on quite a lot. It's only the God bit that's a problem. But I think the problem is with the Bible, evident in 42,000 different denominations of Christianity, which is to say that there is evidence in the Bible of pretty much anything you want. And that is because the book, it's full of a collection of books from disparate authors with different agendas and writing in different places at different times with different sources. And so, and of different genres, right? Yeah. So as a result, you've just got this collection of books. And if you like slavery, you can find something there. If you hate slavery, you can find something there. If you love gays, you can find something there. If you hate gays, you can find something. If you love money, hate money. Completely opposite viewpoints, but you can find evidence for all that in the Bible. Yeah. And so therefore, it's quite a dangerous book, depending on what you set out to do. And it's all, and there's lots of interesting work in the psychology of religion as to an authoritarian parent ends up liking the kind of Yahweh type Christianity, whereas a liberal parent is very much the lovey-dovey Jesus Christianity, if they're Christian parents. And I suppose the question is, what's the direction of causality? Does your psychology does that influence you to choose your type of Christianity, or does your type of Christianity send you down a particular psychological route? So, and there's probably answers to that, but I find that very interesting. But the whole notion, of course, is the Bible. You can take anything from it that you want.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, have you ever seen the movie The Butterfly Effect?
No,
but kind of the reference. The idea of one little change and it causes all these. What were you talking about reminds me a little bit of that movie. It's a guy who has this ability to, like, if he sees a picture from his childhood, or if he opens up his journal from his childhood, he can go back to that moment literally in time with his 25-year-old adult mind, go into his 8-year-old self at that moment for 2 or 3 minutes and make a different choice that completely changes. But of course, once those 2 or 3 minutes are up, and he's back to his adulthood, everything's different now because he's made different changes.
Right? Yeah, it's the whole grandfather paradox, isn't it? But so the butterfly effect is interesting because it's chaos theory. People think is not deterministic. Well, some people, who don't understand it, but it's very deterministic. So what it says is that, like, the weather systems are so chaotic that we don't have the ability to predict them very well because we're humans and we're not as clever as we could be, right? But actually, they are deterministic systems, closed deterministic systems, and as long as you knew the variables at the beginning, then you could predict. They are predictable. If you just need better minds to be able to do that, and the one small change over here can give you a massive change over there. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's I love thinking about it. It's some of this stuff. The philosophy of it is really. It stretches your mind, but it's good. It's stuff you really need to do as a human to really try to understand our existence.
I think there's an interesting point in that, Tim, and you probably might feel this as well in getting interested in certain different areas. And I know this when I go and give public talks on certain topics. It helps to be a polymath, and by that I mean I'm not some genius in every single subject, right? But if I don't have a good working knowledge of theology, and if I don't have a good working knowledge of biblical exegesis, and if I don't have a good working knowledge of philosophy, and if I don't have a good working knowledge of politics, then when I go and give a public talk and someone gives me a question that's kind of related to that, but I need to be able to deal with that. And in fact, they're so interrelated, these subjects, that actually, if I don't understand why people believe what they do, then I'm not going to properly understand the content in the context that it's set, and so on and so forth. My point being is that I think in this day and age of writing books or arguing or presenting worldviews, you absolutely need a good working knowledge of lots of disciplines.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The next book I wanted to mention was, honestly, that it was the one that appealed to me the most, which I'll probably pick up first here. But Beyond an Absence of Faith: Stories about the Loss of Faith and the Discovery of Self. And is it correct that that is not just written by you, but that's also stories from other people?
So that's I just edited it. I don't even think I've got a chapter in there as far as a deconversion story, because mine, I just wrote the introduction. But yeah, it's a collection of deconversion stories from different faiths, but mainly Christianity. And yeah, you know, the sort of book that had you been around in my life a few years back, Tim, you could, and you had you deconverted a few years back, you could have had a chapter in there. But
awesome. Maybe in your 2025 version, I'll.
yeah. I might bring out Beyond 2. Yeah.
Can I ask, with that one, as you were reading those stories and talking to the people, a couple of questions. Did you find people talking much about, as they're going through the actual deconversion, how frequently you'd see the issue of a severe depression? Like some people I've talked to even recently in the last week, they were like, no, I kind of just slowly evolved into a different perspective, and it really didn't like strike me. Whereas for me, and for some other people that I've known, it was like, if you were to picture it as dominoes, and you know, you just need someone to hit that first domino and they all fall. And it was like I was taking these micro steps closer to tipping the first one, but until that first one hits, everything is still standing. And so you're actually, if you're picturing yourself in a big room, and you're 10 yards away, 10 feet away, or I guess it'd be meters for you guys. If you're a couple meters away from it, you don't realize you're slowly moving towards the point where you're about to tip these dominoes. It just feels like everything's still the same, but then all of a sudden you tip it and everything falls. And I describe mine as, I thought about it in great detail for about 18 months. And it started with the genocide issue, then the craziness of this story, like blood magic, scapegoating, all this stuff that is just, you think, especially even just stupid stuff like genital mutilation, like the God of the universe with the stars. The first thing he's going to say is cut off the end of your little boy's pecker, really. But it's like the craziness, and then the origins of Christianity, the pagan parallels. I did and am getting into the astrotheology and numerology, gematria a lot more, but it still was like there was no concept of this is going to lead me to be an atheist. There's just that, and then within an hour, it was like someone sat me in front of a fire hydrant and tied me down and opened that piece of metal off, and the water just came flooding. And within an hour, I was like, I can't believe it. This is it was like a sequence, and it probably wasn't an hour. It's probably more like 20 minutes, but it felt like an hour. It was an hour before I got off the chair, but it was like, I don't think this is real. And it was like, shoot, there's no reason to think this has ever been real. And then you let it hit you, like, shoot, this has never been real. Shoot, there's no God. Shoot, there's no heaven or hell. There's no eternity. I don't go anywhere when I die. Shoot. And it keeps on, you process it, and you're like, and all of a sudden, all the chips are falling, all the dominoes are falling. And for me, my response was, I know this could be saddening, but I just escaped the biggest, mind game ever. I'm just glad I got out. And I was very quickly able to get back my feet. Maybe I did the grieving in the 18 months that I investigated. I don't know, but I hear other people saying this just tore him up for months.
I think that's really interesting. Mate, you should write down your accounts if you haven't already. I run a deconversion series on my blog, actually. I'd love to have your account. But I think one of my friends, Dr. Caleb Lack, who I used to blog with at Skeptic Inc., he runs something, or helps run the Secular Therapy Project for people who deconvert and have psychological trauma in doing that, because like we talked about earlier, you know, when your whole social networks and you know, it's a psychological thing, and you take that away from someone, God's functionality is no longer there, you need to replace it with something that can be a real like shift, and the brain isn't, you know, you might not be well equipped to deal with that. So yeah, for a lot of people that's going to be really challenging. So there are actually, you know, structures and organizations in place to help with that. But yeah, I can totally get that. You know, that's a real, you know, indication of how deeply ingrained, particularly in America, the religion is in society. For a secular country, you've got this weird divergence of the UK and the US. So in the UK, we're not a secular country. So the Queen is the head of the Church of England, and 37% of our primary schools are faith schools, you know, organizationally, and yet we're not very religious, and we are effectively secular, right? And America is constitutionally secular, and yet religion's everywhere, and everyone's in bed with religion, and religion's trying to get in every nook and cranny of every organizational structure in America. And it's just this weird differentiation of the two countries there that I think is quite fascinating. But when religion is so familially, socially ingrained, then I think when people have deconversions, they have an awful lot more to deal with than people in Britain who are deconverting from a nominal Church of England faith, which is basically once a year you might go to midnight mass. Yeah,
that's true. That's true. And it does seem like it's a phenomenon I'm seeing too, that the more you were truly a believer in every, you know, in the worldview sense, like this was real in every sense. This was not a religion. This was a relationship. The more that when you finally escape, there's a pattern of people very, like I think you said earlier, just pissed off. Like, I feel tricked. I feel really tricked, and I feel this obligation to tell people this isn't real.
So common.
And especially this childhood psychological manipulation issues of, you know, the worm theology, you know, you're a nobody before God. You're not, you know, bad. You're dead in your sins. And ultimately, you know, apart from God redeeming you, you know, you're nothing but fuel for the fire.
Yeah, I think the whole broken, you know, humans are inherently broken is quite a destructive viewpoint. I mean, yeah, we understand that in a very sort of nominal sense that nobody's perfect, and we all have, you know, everyone has challenges, but to have that built into your theology in such an overt and explicit way, I think is destructive. Yeah, but the childhood is interesting. I've written a piece that might be of interest to you, which is why do normal people believe ridiculous things? So you look at something like the Noah's Ark and Noah's flood, and scientifically it's just bonkers. There's not enough water molecules on Earth. There's not, you can't get two of each animals. You know, what about, you know, pubic lice? You know, who brought them on? Or like, you know, some of the most horrific, like, animals and diseases and all this kind of stuff, right? So the whole notion is, the whole Noah's flood is bonkers. So why do so many people believe it is literally true? And one of the ways that this can happen is through childhood, which is if you feed ideas into children before they are old enough to be able to know what is probable and improbable, what is nonsense and what's not nonsense, then you're getting things into the cultural sort of baggage that they take with them everywhere. So animals go into the 2x2, hurrah, hurrah. You know, you've got songs and you've got pictures, and you've got everything. So that's a thing, Noah's Ark. It's not ridiculous, right? And then they grow up, and then they learn science, and then they learn this, and then they learn that, and blah, blah, blah. But because that was embedded before this process, it is not vetted by this process.
Right.
So that if they didn't hear about Noah's Ark, and then at the age of 20, after having learned what's probable and improbable and all the kind of childhood education and through adolescence, and then you said, here's a religion, right, that has this Noah's Ark story, blah, 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 blah. They go, that's absolute nonsense. That's bonkers. That's ridiculous. I don't believe that. It's ridiculous. And I don't believe that miracle because of this reason. but they don't do that because they don't apply it to themselves, because that was embedded before they learned these kind of very, very important steps in their education as to what is probable and what's improbable. And so I think, I mean, John Loftus did this so well in his book, The Outsider Test for Faith, which is a really good book that expounds a very simple idea, which is people don't apply the metrics they do to other religions to find them nonsense to their own religions or worldviews.
Yeah.
And so therefore they let themselves off the hook by having kind of double standards. And that's just one example of how that might happen.
It's amazing too that even apart from other religions, that just any issue, even current issues, it's amazing to see the disparity between people's willingness to look deeply and critically and supposedly skeptically at so many issues, such as with coronavirus. Do we need lockdowns? Do we need to wear masks? And people, at least in the Christian circles that I'm exposed to, are just questioning the narrative all over. Masks are stupid. Masks are necessary. They're making it worse. And they're just, whatever people fall on, whichever side they fall on, they're basically saying, let's apply some serious skepticism to the narrative. And you're like, are you kidding me? Like, yeah, you're fine. Do that here with coronavirus, but you're not going to do that with the Bible. Like,
yeah, that's a very good point. And there's also an interesting idea that so many things are connected. I mean, I remember going to talk by Rob Brotherton, who did a PhD on conspiracy theories and how so many are connected, that if you believe one, you believe them all. And you can see, like, I know some people. I know this one person who has gone down a much more conservative Catholic route, more and more, right? But with that, now on Facebook is posting like anti-vax, anti like COVID science stuff and blah, blah, blah. And then, everything's all about abortion now and this and that. And it's like tick box. It's like, I could predict all of these things that you would be professing publicly, because you are going down such a predictable route, but you could say, I suppose, the same about liberal, lefty atheists and stuff like this. But there is an interesting correlation and causation going on between politics and religion. And it's probably why I blog so much about politics these days, because, I don't know. It's just, I think for you to point that out is really pertinent. Why is it that so many fundamentalist Christians in America particularly are questioning mask use and are questioning the science here, where they aren't doing it over there? But they do it for climate change, but they don't do it for this. They do, and it's picking and choosing your narrative and picking and choosing your facts. And that's a dangerous world that we live in now, isn't it?
And I think it does go back to what you said several times. This is more about psychology than, this is more, in some ways, just to way oversimplify it, this is about what mommy and daddy taught me as a kid. I can't question the narrative of what mommy and daddy, they told me God is God. Jesus died for me. If I believe in him, I go to heaven and I live a good life. And it's like, there's something in us that says, I can't question something that started so young. And it's like, by the time, if you've got it instilled in you by the time you're 6, 7, 8, it's like it just gets exponentially harder to step back from the edge and look at what you're doing, what you're believing. Yeah,
and I'll bring into play here a little bit of personal history about my deconversion. So when I was as a child, nominally Christian household in a very typically English way, I went to Sunday school until I kicked off, and my mum pulled me out of Sunday school. It's like, no, it's not working for you. But there was no religion at home. My dad both of my parents at the time were in the forces. And in the end, what happened was they moved abroad and I went to boarding school, because the forces generally at the time used to pay for boarding school fees. And here's an interesting thing, because what we kind of know about children or humans is that you are the product of your genes and your environment. And if your genes and the environment are housed in the same place, right? So you've got your mum and your dad who've given you your genes, and you live with them in the house together. They provide both the genetic and environmental cocoon in which you are brought up in, so the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But what happened with me, and this is a really interesting, I think, observation about my youth, is that having gone to boarding school, I was not at home half the time. And so I was brought up by my peers and by an organization and a structure that weren't my parents. And then when I went back home for the holidays, maybe my dad would be at work a lot, or I'd be doing things through the Navy, like activities for kids and stuff during the holidays. And so actually I had a very varied childhood where my parents didn't play the very close kind of suffocating role that maybe some parents do in children's lives. And so I was able not to become the person I wanted to be. I actually became a person who was defined by a much wider environment, I suppose. That meant that now when I look at why are my politics so utterly different from my dad's? You know, why? Because if I had been brought up in that household the entire of my childhood, I probably would just be a carbon copy of my dad, you know, in the way that I think, but I'm not. And I have a lot to thank for being sent off to boarding school, oddly. You know, it was this very different, you know, flower beds to become a grow from a seed to a shoot to a sapling in. And I think also where it was a nominally Christian, well, it wasn't actually, it was quite a Christian school, but in an English way, not an American way. So you're Christian, you know, not that you have Christian schools, but you would know as an evangelical that when Christianity is part of your childhood, it's a very overt and explicit part of your childhood. So everything is seen through the prism of Christianity. Yes. Whereas nothing is seen through the prism of Christianity in a childhood like the one I sort of had. Even when you go to a Christian school where you go and do your scripture lessons or RE lessons or whatever they were called, and it becomes like a lesson that you do. So you compartmentalize it over there, and then you just go and be a normal human being. And then when you're in the RE lesson, you think about God. And so then when I got confirmed, right, and I said, and I believed in God. If you ask me as a 16-year-old, yes, I believe in God. Right, I got confirmed. But when I look back at it now, the interesting thing is I didn't have the first clue about any theology and how it worked. I didn't understand the Trinity. I didn't understand Jesus dying for our sins. It was just something that you said and you heard. But I didn't think, how does that work? What does it mean? It was just, you go to chapel like 3 times a week in the school, you know, 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there, and then a bit more on Sunday. And then you kind of get bored. You chip away at the pew in front of you. You're like, you know, whatever. And then because it's so structural and organized, you kind of, I suppose you probably react against it. And so the whole process of that was really interesting because it was very different from probably your childhood experiences with Christianity, where you would have understood it more. It was far more evangelical. With me, God was someone I talked to at night, maybe if I wanted something, or if I just was a bit lonely and fancied a chat. And then what happened is I left school at 18, went backpacking for a year. And I think it was in that period, just as I was leaving school, probably when I was about 18, where I thought, this is ridiculous. This is a nonsense, broadly on account of the problem of evil, I think, as far as I remember. And then when I went traveling, I remember backpacking around Brunei and seeing this gold-topped mosque, this huge ostentatious affair. And then just outside it was shantytown on stilts. And looking at the disparity there between the inequality and how could God, you know, rubber stamp this happening? How can these people live like this? And yet you've got a golden top mosque there. What's going on? And then as you travel and you find more, I mean, I'd lived around the world anyway. So my Christianity was only very nominal. And as I say, very badly understood. But then I rejected it on account of these very emotional problem of evil things we kind of talked about earlier. And then it became much more, you know, you read the God delusion, you start getting into arguments of free will, and then 10 years later, you know, it becomes more formalized in philosophy for me. But what was interesting is how much I didn't understand Christianity, yet could proclaim myself a Christian, that whole no true Scotsman. How could I be a Christian when I didn't understand the basic tenets of the Christian faith? So
would you say then that when you did officially sort of deconvert, that it wasn't as painful as some of the other stories you've seen, just because it wasn't as deep in your psyche?
It wasn't as it wasn't even remotely painful. It was like I mean, literally, it's like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to wear my cross anymore because I don't really believe. That's it. That I think that was I mean, when you talk about the power of your deconversion, sitting down and the fire hydrant, the dominoes, and huge, like the sense of liberty and being, you know, the burden being lifted from your shoulders, I imagine, and just suddenly, whoa, and then thinking, why have I, for me, it was literally, I don't think I'm going to wear this cross anymore.
Well, could I ask this?
I'm going to play football.
Was there any parts of losing mentally, intellectually losing eternity in heaven that was difficult?
Oh, and that's really interesting. Yeah. So for a lot of people, this is called mortality salience, and it is very prevalent. There's something called terror management theory. So terror management theory is how we manage our terror of death, particularly, and atheism is a tough sell because it's like you die, that's it, shit happens, you'll be worm food soon. And that's a hard sell, right? Because you have that compared to eternal life in heaven. And of course, you're going to be one of the Christians that goes to heaven, even though we know that most people don't. But everyone's biased enough to think they're the type of Christian that's going to go to heaven. So you're all right, Jack. And you're going to live for eternity in heaven, which is the single biggest, the greatest conceptual reward you can imagine, right? There's nothing greater than that the mind can imagine, because that is the definition of heaven. And likewise, if you don't believe it, it's the single worst thing in human conception, hell. Whatever that may be, whatever's the worst thing that you can think of, that's hell. So what you have is unbelievable. It's the strongest form of emotional blackmail you can possibly conceive as a human. So the heaven or hell paradigm means that if you are a true hardcore Christian, if you don't believe, you're in real trouble, and if you do believe, you are in awesomeness forever. And atheism can't beat that. You can't compete.
Yeah, exactly. It's fantasy beyond fantasy, or horror beyond horror, and you bring in Pascal's wager, and people they just can't get past it. I know that it didn't hurt me per se in the depression sense, but it was hard to wrap my mind around. And I think the movie that I know a lot of other people appreciate it as a reference is The Matrix, and just that sense of you just got unplugged, and it's like in the movie, I think in the first one someone says when they realize what happened that they're unplugged, like, could I go back? I think it was Neo said it. He said, can I go back? And they're like, no, but would you really want to? And I'm probably butchering the quote, but just the idea of why would you want to go back to it? It's not real. It's a pretend world.
Oh yeah, so I would arguably disagree, because I've written about this. It's the experience machine. I don't know if we've got time for this, but basically, if you could guarantee that you were going to have a 100% amazingly awesome experience where you could do everything you wanted to do, it's just amazing, but you're just plugged in, but you wouldn't know you were plugged in. Would you choose that, or would you run the gauntlet of getting cancer or getting run over by a car and seeing your child get mauled by a lion? Do you know what I mean? So it's like, I genuinely, me now as a human, I think I would plug myself into the machine if I could 100% guarantee, if I knew 100%, A, that I wouldn't know I was plugged in, and B, that I was going to have an awesome existence, and C, the world could operate, you could have biodiversity, all the animals out there could do whatever they like, because I'm just plugged into this machine. Thank you very much. I would take it. Yeah,
it's a fascinating question. I think,
but that's separate from theological.
I'll have to think about it.
It's a proper philosophical question. I've written an article.
Yeah, it's a good one. I'll have to think about it and get back to you on that one. I'm not sure. I think what I would want to say right now that I think I'd still choose to stay unplugged, but I see your point there, especially if you had a very good chance of your life going bad quickly. If you're like, all right, you're going to, if I could tell you, you're going to get cancer, your kids are going to get killed in a car accident, just blah, blah, blah. You're going to lose an eye, or you could go have a wonderful life in a simulated world. That's an interesting concept. I'll have to give that some thought.
There's something similar to what you were saying there. There's something also called John Rawls's veil of ignorance. And this kind of where I think this informs my politics quite a lot at the moment. But it's also just a generally useful tool to use to look at the world. Have you heard of the veil of ignorance? So the veil. I think
I've heard of the term, but not an explanation.
So it's to say that imagine you could exist on Earth, right? But you can't guarantee where you're going to live, who you're going to be, whether you're going to be rich, poor, disabled, able-bodied, whatever, you might be born disfigured, whatever. How do you, what moral system would you then prefer to be in place, given that you can't guarantee who you're going to be? So a lot of moral systems sort of might end up being beneficial to particular subsets of society, but if you're not in that subset, this is where it becomes useful for politics, which is to say that, okay, I'm not an ethnic minority, and I actually am disabled now technically because I've got multiple sclerosis. But so therefore, what would be the right policy for this government to have, based on the fact that I can't guarantee who I can't guarantee who the next person born into this country might be. So what's fair for everyone? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so therefore, it's a very useful, the veil of ignorance. Like, if you can't tell who you're going to be, or you can't tell who someone else is going to be in your given country or your given moral network, then what is the best moral framework to adopt that is best, given that you might say, I think this is best, but actually that only is really beneficial for people who wear glasses or whatever. Yeah, I think it's a really, really useful tool to have, and it kind of informs my politics quite a lot at the moment.
Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff. I feel like between your multi-thousand article blog and all your books and all the other topics I see on your videos and stuff, there's just so much good stuff here. I feel like I could dive into each one, and I would love to follow up with you at some point, before too long, with maybe picking one or two deeper ones. I do want to ask, you definitely get into the ideas. I'm just looking at down at my notes at some of your book titles, but you get into the idea, just the problem of God, the problem of, you even have the book called The Problem with God, Classical Theism.
I almost brought this up earlier. Yeah. So classical theism, and it kind of goes back to the free will thing as well, no, it goes back to everything. Like, if you believe in classical theism, where God is all loving, all knowing, and all powerful, then if you're a believer in that kind of God, everything in the world has to be explicable through that paradigm, right? That's your prism of seeing the world. So if you stub your toe in the morning, that cannot be gratuitous. So you're talking about the problem of evil. You can't, if you stub your toe in the morning, or if you get mauled by a tiger, or a tsunami kills 240,000 people, it doesn't matter whether it's the tiniest bit of pain or a mass amount of pain. You've got to explain that with an all-loving God. So why did I stub my toe? Why is that necessary? Because it has to be necessary. If it's not necessary, then it's gratuitous. And if it's gratuitous suffering, God is not all loving, right? So that's just one example. But if you take on, and if you then add in that God has divine foreknowledge, so knows everything in advance, then why create at all if he's going to create broken? I always talk about this idea that God is morally culpable for all our sins. That's why atonement doesn't work, right? So if I was a CEO of a car company, right, and I produced a car, and I was a designer as well, and I produced a car that knowingly would crash and kill people who used it. Not all of them, but some of them would knowingly crash and kill people. Would I not be had up in court for being morally responsible for creating those crashes? Likewise, if I was a scientist in a lab and I created a sentient life form, and I knew, as I designed it and created it, I knew 100% indubitably that life force I create would go out into the local town and rape and murder and kill and do horrible things. Some might do nice things and donate to charity, but a lot will do horrible things. Is it not right that the police would come back to my lab and say, excuse me, Mr. Scientist, you've created these things that have done these horrible things. You knew about it in advance, but you created them anyway, and you designed them. You are morally culpable for that having happened.
Yeah.
So if you believe God has full divine foreknowledge and all of those aspects, there are so many problems associated with that version of God. Classical theism is a right minefield of problems. So I wrote an ebook, The Problem of God, because it's about how you define God, right?
It makes me think of the Eden story too. Like, if God since God knows everything that could happen, why not just make it so that serpent, the devil, can't get in there? I mean, why would you why would you send a psychopathic killer into a kindergarten class? You wouldn't. You'd keep them completely separate and keep them safe.
Well,
And
I think the bigger problem to do with that. So following on from what I said about designing and creating, right? If Adam and Eve, if you believe in the real Adam and Eve, right? If Adam and Eve represent humanity so that they were punished, they failed the test. Sorry, they failed the test, and because they represent humanity, you could have put anyone in there from humanity, and we would have failed the test.
Right.
Then that's why we're punished for the fall, right? Because they are representative of us. Okay. Then that's poor design, right? So if any one of us were put into the Adam and Eve mold or the Adam and Eve position, then we would have failed. Then God's a poor designer, because every one of us would have failed the test. If Adam and Eve are not representative of us, then why are we being punished for the fall when Adam and Eve are so dissimilar from us that they wouldn't represent what we would have done in that same position? And this is a two-horn dilemma I talk about in that same book, which is that there's no other option that I can see. There's no excluded middle, there's nothing. There's just these two options, that either God is a bad designer or God is unfair by choosing Adam and Eve to represent us when they are not representative of us.
Yeah. And what's amazing to me, this just with those kind of moral questions, is that it seems like for people that are in it, like really truly Christians, that there's never this option of maybe it's just not real. Like maybe, like C.S. Lewis, he had this paradigm he put in one of his books where he said, look, you can't take Jesus as a great preacher, as just a good moral man. He was the Lord, he was a liar, or he was a lunatic. I'm like, where's the fourth option that he wasn't even real, or at least he was, some. Yeah. So you broke up there. Say that one more time.
Yeah. So Bart Ehrman said that there is a fourth option. Yeah, Bart Ehrman added a fourth option of legend. Yeah.
Yeah. Legend, or if you're a mythicist.
Absolutely.
Like me, but just that he may not have even existed at all.
Yeah. I think. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a mythicist, but my conclusion is synonymous with mythicism. So I believe that the Jesus existed historically as a human. There's some kernel there, but all we can know is that he was an itinerant preacher who died by crucifixion, probably, or died in Jerusalem. That's probably all we know, right? Everything else is embellishment in the Gospels.
Right.
So while I don't think they concocted Jesus out, I think Jesus was a human. But what we're told about Jesus is so far removed from the truth that it might as well be myth. In fact, it is myth. Yeah. So although I'm not a mythicist, I am effectively and pragmatically a mythicist, because I would say that there's almost 0% of the Gospels that is reflective of true history.
Yeah. Agreed, 100%. I did want to end with just a more of a fun thing that I was watching a bunch of your videos in preparation for this, and one of the things you do is you sometimes speak at just like a humanist society meeting, and I thought it was awesome thing that you share people's poetry about their experience with all this stuff. And one of the you have a book on it, is that right? Filling the Void.
But there's all the ones I read out at the events. I do.
Do you happen to have, are any of those bookmarks on the one about what a foolish race we are? If not, I've got it here. I can read it. But that one really stuck out to me, and I thought that was fantastic. And I'd love to hear more from that. That I think you said it was a young woman from that poetess, what she writes.
Do you know who it's by?
You had said it was by a young woman in the video. Starts with what a foolish race we are.
Look. There's what strange creatures we are, but no, it's not that one. Do you know what? I'll have to. Sure. I'll have to look that up next time we chat.
Sure. Well, I've got the text for it here. Let me just read it, and maybe you can elaborate on what maybe how it impacted you to hear it. The words you gave were, what a foolish race we are, spending our lives peeking around the sides of the mirror, trying to find the person on the other side. We leap over the mirror, pouncing onto thin air. what a foolish race we are, that we cannot see that it is merely an image of ourselves.
Oh, I just got shivers.
That's a beautiful, beautiful way to put it. But yet it's so true that we are, the question of, are we made in God's image? No, he's made in ours.
Yeah.
And that when you realize that we've been making God in our image all this time, that itself kind of shakes you up. But what, I guess, just how do you help people, and how do you yourself come up with the creative side of this? Because you're obviously dealing with a lot of deep philosophical things. You're dealing with a lot of historical items, but you're also bringing a lot of art into this. And I'd love to just hear more about what that looks like in your life, and especially with the humanist societies that you work with.
Well, I mean, I'm just, your regular atheist thinker, but yeah, I mean, I speak at lots of humanist societies, and humanism, I think, is a really important thing. Talking about what you're going to replace that empty hole with. Interestingly, that's why this is called Filling Void, right? And there's quite a bit of symbolism in this cover here, because you've got a religious, that's a stained glass window by the looks of it, from a church that's just in the middle of a field. I think it was part of an art exhibition or something. And it's the idea that, and it's a very religious looking symbol, this, where you've got a light coming from behind it, but everything's corroded around it. There's nothing there. It's just this, the whole idea is the edifice that was religion in your life, that void that's there now, what do you fill it with? And humanism for me is an affirmative, like, whereas atheism is needed. It doesn't tell you anything about who you are. It's a very, and although Christians love to attack people with the term atheism, it's a very not nebulous term, but it doesn't tell you anything. Whereas humanism is more positive affirmation of your beliefs in the context of a larger moral framework. And so I think, how can we as humanity be the best we possibly can in the absence of an afterlife, and in the absence of God, and so on and so forth. And I think, therefore, humanism, I think it's important to start. I think what things like the Sunday Assembly were so useful is providing positive Sunday collections of like-minded people who can affirm their beliefs in a positive view of humanity without God. I think that's important going forward. I think you need to draw people together in a positive way, that is saying something rather than not being negative about something else.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question, though.
Yeah, no, that was good. I feel like that's part of probably the missing piece for me in my journey. Like, I feel like I'm kind of charting out a bunch of different steps of what I was thinking through to get through all this, and where I've thought through since I escaped. But like, there's this missing piece where, not missing in the truest sense, but just in my mind as I reflect on this, you can list all the reasons you left. You can say, well, genocide and racism began to offend me. Land theft and genital mutilation, slavery, it began to offend me. Okay, that's a really good starting point. So what else? Well, I began to realize that the craziness of it, the Noah story, the other stories, it's this crazy stuff. The pagan parallels, the Egyptians were circumcising and doing blood sacrifice and blood magic long before the Israelites were ever doing it. And so you get the pagan parallels, and it begins to just add up. And you feel like, okay, I've got these fantastic reasons to believe that Christianity was basically just a mystical Jewish Greco-Roman mystery cult, and hyper focused on copycatting from the Old Testament and from Greek epic works. And so you can put all these pieces together, but there's a part of me that feels like, as I look at all that, I think I shouldn't need that. I should be able to just look at this book and say, that's really stupid. Like, I don't need to know about.
That's going back to that Noah's Ark kind of thing, that when you've grown up with it and it's part of you, and it's a cultural baggage, you don't question it in the same way. So if you now knew nothing about the Bible, and someone came to you and said, right, I've got this really cool religion where okay, God created the world in 7 days, and then but you can interpret that in whatever way you want, and you've got this. God then realized that the creation that he designed and created was actually rubbish, even though he's perfect. So he destroyed everyone apart from 8 people, shoved all the animals on a boat, blah blah blah, and took someone through the whole thing. And then it got to the point where God again thought, God had designed and created humanity, but they made all the wrong decisions, even though he designed and created them. That sin that they ended up doing, he needed to pay himself for. So he decided to send himself down in human form, sacrifice himself to himself, and then lift himself back into heaven to sit on his own right hand for eternity in a lovely place. But that's a really big sacrifice, and that somehow pays. We don't really know how, because everyone disagrees on it within Christendom, but that pays for the sins of humanity. You'd just be going, that's nonsense. That's obviously nonsense. But because you are slowly brought up in that throughout your whole life, and you don't question it from that position of knowledge and experience of life, then it doesn't become nonsense. It's not nonsense because it's bypassed all those vetting processes.
Yeah,
I don't know. Because, and again, it comes to the outsider test for faith again. If you apply the same metrics that you do to other religions to your own in a really fair and balanced way, in the same way that you do for those other religions, you would probably find your own religion wanting. There's a great map in Loftus's book. It's kind of a meme, which is a map of the Earth. It says, here is a map where everyone believes in the theory of relativity, right? Or believes in whatever science and that, and the whole map is blue. In other words, it doesn't matter what country you're from, everyone adheres to that kind of epistemological framework. And then it's like a map of what religions people believe in, and it's completely geographical. So it's like, so if you're born in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh, you believe in Islam. But if you're born in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh or New York, you're going to believe in the theory of relativity, right? So it's just like religion is parochial and defined by geography, and straight away that should lead you to go, we've got a bit of an issue here, because it depends on where I'm born as to what I believe. And so you start using those kind of vetting procedures, you will find that your own religion is probably nonsense.
It feels like people don't deal with that issue enough to say just how you were raised makes such a big difference. But I feel like just to kind of, again, I guess, put a little bit of praise on what you're doing for this, the poetry part, like that is just so important, I think, to step back from the facts of it all. I mean, we have to dive into the facts, but like for example, years ago, I was working at a job. I was in Philadelphia, and I used to ride the train every day. And one of the very good friends I had was this older Black gentleman who was about to retire, and he was always writing. And we started talking about it. He was always writing poetry. And 9/11 happened, and he asked me maybe a few weeks after it happened. He's like, "What are you doing to kind of think through this? Where's your poetry about this?" And I said, honestly, I haven't. I watched a lot of news articles about 9/11. I've seen politicians talk about what we're going to do next and the war, but I haven't really processed it that way. And he's like, you got to process it. You got to process. This isn't just a fact of history. This is your human story. Process it. And it was really a good reminder to me that there's more to this than just, because I've been dealing with facts left and right. I mean, it keeps me up at night. I'll wake up at night, 2 a.m, and be like, I want to read something else about mimesis, about the Greek epic works and how they have impacted the Gospels. And I'll do it. I'll find some new fact I haven't, but it's like, it's so factual. It's like, wait a second, you were, whether you know it or not, you were traumatized. And I don't want to over exaggerate that, but it's a traumatic thing to be lied to that deeply and then to escape it. But it's like, there's also just this feeling of, what was your life about for 40 years? It was about wanting to please somebody. This whole, I need someone to say, you're okay. You're good. You had a problem, but now we've fixed it. We're okay. And this it's like a whole relationship that you've built in your mind that's not actually there. I mean, and when you lose it, you have to think through it. This
is a whole, psychological aspect of religion, right? What you're talking about there, deeply psychological. But before that, then, with your guy on a train, it's the importance of art and humanities in giving a full representation of humanity, right?
Yeah.
And people deal with things in different ways, and this is why the arts exist. Yeah, this is why the arts exist. There will be some kind of function evolutionarily as to why we produce things in music and art. But certainly, even now, no matter what you believe about evolution, art has a function for us. It's an outlet for us in some way, and poetry for some people is an outlet. And in terms of this book, it's a collection of poems that are expressions of how people are feeling about. These are particularly poems about a lack of feeling in their lives about a lack of belief in God. Or it might be some poems about evolution, some poems about this, some poems about morality and whatnot. There are different categories of poems in there, but you know, it provides an opportunity to have an outlet that isn't just, as you say, this kind of non-fiction, factual exposition of atheism and the scientific worldview. There can be awe and wonder in the world of an atheist or humanist or scientific naturalist.
Yeah, the numinous part that Hitchens like to talk about. Could I end by asking, you've obviously done a lot, and there's a lot more books here. I'll give a link to them on the Amazon under the video, but could I ask, in terms of future projects, what, if you were to put aside any projects you're working on right now, just what is your dream project that hasn't started yet? It's kind of been fizzling on the back burner for a while.
The resurrection one, I'm bloody loving writing. I'm really enjoying that, oddly. And I'm also trying, so I wrote a book in 2016. My first fiction book was about a pandemic.
Oh, wow.
Right? So the Metamorphosis, Survival of the Fittest, right? And I'm writing the sequel to that now. It should be out fairly soon. But
is that the Curse of the Maya?
No, The Curse of the Maya is a different one. That's a kid's book. I'm really proud of that. That's a great book. I'm proud of them all, obviously.
Yeah.
But pandemic. So fiction. But what I'd love, obviously, I don't know whether this is because we all want validation. So I wrote this book, a kid's book, in mind, you know, specifically the ending, and thinking, right, I've written this. We wrote it. I wrote it with someone else, quite cynically, in terms of what schools would want, what teachers want from a book. Really well written, decent book with all the X, Y, and Z, tick, 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 but also a really good story. And the ending, I can see that as a film. And we're bringing an American person in there because, you know, that's good for filmmaking, you know. So I suppose my ideal would be to write something like that gets turned into a film and see other people. So I gave some Zoom meetings the other day to schools, three classes of kids held up my book, and they were learning it in their schools. They were studying this book. That's awesome. That was a really weird, I don't know whether it's validation, but it's just a weird thing that other people say, this is good enough that I'm going to teach it to my children, right? So, you know, thank you for that. And what do you think about the writing process? And it's just a weird scenario. So I suppose if I was to take that to the nth degree, it would be to write a book that enough people think is worthy of turning into a film. That would be great. But again, that's just personal aggrandizement, isn't it? So I don't know if there's too much value in that other than patting myself on the back. As far as non-fiction and atheism goes, it would be something like producing a book that is a go-to book for people who are wanting to question or who are questioning their faith in a particular area. But not because I want validation, but because what I want to do is produce something that's useful to someone else. Do you know what I mean? I don't want it to be the go-to book because I get to sell lots of copies and, whoa, that's brilliant, well done me. I want it to have an impact on, maybe that's a form of validation. You want to have an impact on the world and have legacy. I don't know. But it would be lovely to have a book that is useful to people, that they can draw something from to inform them of a more accurate view of the world. Yeah. But that could be any of my books. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. I don't know. There's no one kind of topic, because I've now covered quite a few topics. Yeah. that I feel like I need to get into. I think the resurrection is a nice bookend to Jesus's life for me. I've done the nativity, I've done the resurrection, or will have done the resurrection, and I think that's good for that. I don't know. Who knows, Tim? Who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe
Well,
you can tell me something, right?
Well, I'll tell you mine in a 30-second nutshell. It's, that that book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, I think it is.
Is that Peter Boghossian?
Yeah, I think I'm getting the title right or close to it. A Manual for Creating Atheists.
Yeah.
I would like to create something similar that's specifically focused on Christianity. I know that his book would obviously relate to Christians deconverting, but I'd love to write one that basically was a manual for Christian deconversion, to the point of kind of taking like the very best of everything and putting it in a, like, how you said earlier that, for people to think through some of this, they have to have a certain level of education. You're not just going to dive into Homeric epics. You have to know what you're doing. I would love to create a project / book that just put it on the lowest shelf, but still gave people the information. Like, I feel like my burden is just, I feel like I was never given the information. I mean, I went to Bible college, mission school. I've memorized entire books of the Bible, thousands and thousands of verses. I had it all, and I never heard any of the stuff that actually would have made a world of difference. And I feel like that's my dream, at least my first dream. Hopefully there'll be some more that come along after that. But just, I want to give people the information that says, where they say, you know what? It wasn't a fair playing field intellectually before. I wasn't given all the facts. With this, once you put this on the table and slide it across to me and I read it, now I have what I need to make an honest decision. I didn't have that before. It wasn't fair. The cards, the dice were loaded from the start in favor of this theism, and you took it and you put the playing field in a level field. I feel like it's my biggest heart, because I feel like it's the one thing that I wish I had.
Challenge for a project like that is, how big do you make it? You can somehow, it could be.
It could get,
ends up being everything.
Yeah, it could
but
go
that sounds like a really worthy book, mate. You should think about a proposal to that somehow.
Yeah, it's definitely my heart. And if I had a little more time, we have, again, 4 kids under age 6. With more time, I might be able to make some more progress. I wanted to end with just a real light note. I usually like to do an icebreaker up front. I forgot to do it, but I'll ask you to anyway to wrap up. If you had chosen to, or were to choose to move out of the UK, and you were in a place where you really couldn't get the food that you're used to, what would your favorite food be that you would miss the most, to be, maybe fairly difficult to replicate or get in a new country? Like, what's your favorite kind of stuff to get there?
Well, so here's the thing. So I was diagnosed with primary progressive multiple sclerosis a couple of years ago, right? Which is, thanks God. So that's obviously, there. So I'm a vegan. All my boys have just got back.
Okay.
So I'm a vegan. So that means that my answer to this might be a bit skewed.
Okay.
Vegan plus fish. So I'm not a proper vegan. But in the old days, I suppose it probably would have been fajitas or something, or an English cooked breakfast, or a nice roast meal. But they're your classics. But now it's going to be like a vegan burger with vegan mayo and whatever. But as soon as I say that, I'll just be attacked by anti-vegan, like, stop trying to press your veganism on me. I wrote an article on why the psychological kickback to veganism, which I find really interesting. But that's a story for another day. Just brings in, that was light-hearted, but you've made me talk about multiple sclerosis and being disabled. So thanks, mate.
I'm sorry. Now, can I ask, how are you doing at this point?
So I had stem cell therapy in Russia a couple of years ago. Last year, a year and a half ago, and I am stable, which is great. So it's worked so far. Mm-hmm. So that's really, really awesome. I had to do some fundraising for that because I had to do it privately because it's not available on the NHS. It will be, I think, soon at some point. But yeah, so that's a real challenge for me cognitively, and I'm quite good when I can do, like, I'm writing about the resurrection now, and I concentrate on one topic. I've done quite well today talking to you, actually, by bringing in loads of different topics. I used to be really good at that. And I could, in public, because talking earlier about being a bit polymath-like, delving into loads. And now my memory isn't so good that it's a bit cloudy, and I forget names and I forget things. And so things are a bit more challenging. And I suppose I just had, again, I have God to thank for that. So that's, yeah, nice. Maybe he thought this atheist is getting a bit big for his boots. Let's take him down a couple of notches. Or maybe he doesn't exist and it's just how the world works. I don't know. Yeah. I do know, actually. I've got a pretty good idea.
Yes, you do. Well, I'm very, very glad that you're able to get that treatment. I did read a little bit about it with your trip to Moscow, and I'm very, very much hopeful that you can stay healthy through it all. And I'm appreciative you're obviously taking the, you know, the life and the energy and the vitality that you have, and you're using it for some amazing things with, obviously, with your awesome family and with your books and your videos and your blog. And so you're a machine. It appears on the surface. And I was saying before that we started the video, you know, you're an inspiration. You've taken so many topics that are hard, and you've dove in with no reservation, just said, let's do it. Let's get these topics on the table. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate your voice in all this, and hope you keep on writing all these good thoughts down that come to you. And I just appreciate your willingness to share with us today.
Oh, thanks, Tim. Really kind words, and thank you very much. And thanks for this opportunity. I've really enjoyed it. And you know, I can bang on for a long time about anything. So if you ever you know want another chat, I'm your man.
Absolutely, I'll take you up. I'll take you up on that very shortly. So, thank you so much, and I'll let you get to your boys. But thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.